Hi, I'm David Wiseman, and this is Whispers to Live. Up until this point, in my previous videos, I've discussed in a very basic way how the self develops. In those past videos, I introduced the elements or conditions of vulnerability, vigilance, memory, language, and the idea of a constructive or constructed moral narrative. Today, I will discuss more formally the successive phases that the self undergoes during development, okay? And there are 4 successive phases that I will be talking about. And they roughly correspond with human physical development. Okay, so the first phase, as you might have guessed, is vulnerability. Now, vulnerability, this first phase, occurs from the moment of conception through to just before we were born. So, from conception through the embryo, through the fetus, up until we're born, this is the phase of vulnerability. Now, if you want, I've got them written down, all these phases and a description of them on my website at whisperstolive.com. That's whisperstolive.com. So after this, you can go and you can just have a look at it to remind yourself of what it is I've spoken about. Sometimes when a person sees it, after they've heard it, it kind of gels in their memory. Okay, so the first phase is vulnerability. The second phase includes vulnerability, but this is where vigilance emerges and becomes prominent. Okay, vulnerability and vigilance are the second phase of the development of self. And this occurs roughly, or at the time of birth, infancy, to roughly 11 months old. Okay, phase 3 of the development of self includes vulnerability, vigilance, and now memory and language emerge. And this phase 3 is at the toddler age. Okay, so roughly 1 year to 3 years old, phase 3 of the development of self. Now, phase 4 includes, of course, vulnerability, vigilance, memory, and language, but it's here where the moral narrative emerges. And all of these elements work together and they form the self. And so that's from childhood, roughly 4 years old, through adolescence, adulthood, all the way to death. Now, the moral narrative of a child is much, much less sophisticated and complex than, say, the moral narrative of an adult. But with that said, the moral narrative still exists because that is the self. All right. Important features of these phases that I want to just highlight, and that is that with each successive phase, that's phase 1 through 2, 3, and 4, with each successive phase, the additional element that emerges becomes prominent, just as prominent as the previous element. That is to say that, for example, in phase 1, I'm not suggesting that vigilance doesn't at some point begin to emerge there, but in phase 2, vigilance becomes prominent. Okay, so they're kind of graded in degrees, these elements. They emerge with each successive phase. All right. Another very important point to remember, I've said it in previous videos, I'm going to continue saying it. vulnerability never leaves the self-experience. Vulnerability is within each phase of the development of self. Vulnerability begets vigilance, which through the capacity we have for memory allows us to develop complex language, thereby creating narratives, self-narratives, which are moral in nature. Now, I discussed the moral nature of the self-narratives last video, and I'm just going to remind everyone that what I mean by moral narratives is that the self-narrative is built within an existential space which addresses three moral questions. And those questions are, what's the meaning of life? What is it good to be? And what is my obligation to others? So each self-narrative, which is moral in nature, will address those questions, and either implicitly, which is more subtly, or explicitly, which is obvious. But the definition of the moral narrative is a narrative which addresses those three existential questions. To the extent that those questions are problematic to answer within a self-narrative, the person experiences a crisis. You could call it a moral crisis. So I'm going to leave it there for today about the moral narrative, or describing it any further than that. It's a lot more complex than that, but this is a good foundation. One other thing I would add is that because we are moral in nature, our narratives, our self-narratives are moral in nature, it means that we are responsible for our behavior. You see, the moral nature of our self-narratives literally is values that we have for what is it good to be, what's the meaning of life, and what's my obligation to others. And we act on those values. And because we act on those values and there's a will to act toward adhering to those values, we therefore are responsible for our behavior because we choose to act in accordance with those values. So I'm going to leave it there today. I'm just going to add, next week, we're going to be talking about the spiritual component of the self. Up until this point, we have talked about how we as people, since we were conceived and born and lived our lives up to this point, how we have interacted with the material world, okay? And how the material world has contributed to our moral narratives on who we are. Okay, next week, I'm going to be talking about the spiritual influence on the self. I hope you enjoyed this video. I certainly enjoy making them. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button and remember to subscribe for more videos. Until next time, I'm David Wiseman, and this is Whispers to Live.